In the wake of the destruction of the Civil War in the South, the aftermath was pretty bad. Of course, you had Sherman's March to the Sea. He burned down Atlanta. Richmond was torn to pieces. Charleston, all kinds of different places all throughout the South was really desolate. So for white Southerners, many of them had their land confiscated by the Union Army or burned down. They were largely starved because all their ports were blocked and other Union troops blocked other different entries for the South to resupply itself. So you had a lot of starving Southerners, which by the war's end had caused a lot of dissension anyway. It was like, okay, we cry uncle, tap, I'm going to tap out. Um, there are a lot of different things in and around that. So the South had largely been just devastated. And, for even your wealthiest Southerners, if they had Confederate money, well, that was completely worthless. There's nothing you can do about it. So even Confederate currency and Confederate bonds, you're stripped of that. You're also stripped of your slaves that you used to have. So you have a lot of white Southerners who are now facing starvation and homelessness, which is a first for a lot of different folks, especially those who had come from your middle type classes and even your planter class. So things were going to be really difficult for a lot of Southerners. And as bad as they were for Southern white people, they were just as bad, if not worse, for black people in the South. So, yeah, while you had over 3 million slaves that are now free, they emerge from their slavery. Uh, they're going to look for a new life and a new way of freedom. Except the only thing is, the overwhelming majority of them don't own anything. They don't have anything to their name other than the clothes on their back. And that's it. So, what do you do about that? Reconstruction became a different symbol for Southern whites and for Southern blacks. It meant different things. They had different conceptions for what white people thought it would be and what black people would think it would be. Southerners wanted, in the aftermath, to try and restore as much a semblance of normalcy as they possibly could. Okay, they wanted to try and get back to the antebellum South, obviously without slavery. That's not going to happen, but as much as its form and control as possible, that's what they would aim for. They fought a whole war to preserve their local autonomy, if you will, uh, and also their supremacy. Okay, I don't think you can really argue against those things. For black people, their independence really means more independence from white control. They want more of a stake and a say in their lives. They're not eager to go back to Africa or anything else that I've heard people argue. Their ancestors may have been brought here from Africa, but African American slaves, by the mid 1860s, the overwhelming majority of them have no tie to Africa other than being of African descent. That's it. They don't want to go to Liberia or any place along those lines. They were brought here, they want to make their way here, and who's to blame them? Okay? The thing is, though, is that they don't have anything. You have all these newly freed black people who are leaving plantations in droves, but they don't have anywhere to go. They don't have a home. They don't have any possessions. So what do you do? The Union Army had confiscated lands that had been left behind by various different white planters and whatnot. And so you have various different pockets and regions to where land would be redistributed to former slaves that had been previously owned by plantation owners that would now go towards people who maybe used to work the land. Or perhaps people can be introduced to new lands, or maybe they'd be able to occupy it for cheap, or something along those lines. So, roughly about 33,000 acres in South Carolina and Georgia alone were allocated for this very purpose, to where former slaves can now work land that they either used to work itself or perhaps maybe um, could have and serve as a new start. So you have former slaves over the course of 5 months immediately after the Civil War. You'd have, as a total in the South, not just in Carolina, but in the total South, you'd have over 400,000 acres reallocated as had been confiscated by the Union Army in the South. Now it's going to be worked and shared by former black slaves. Okay. Um, that also being said, though, there had to be something to kind of integrate former slaves into society. You're establishing an independence movement, an independence from white people. But if you don't have anything to your name other than the clothes on your back, then what? Okay? Um, so the Freedmen's Bureau was established technically before the Civil War got started, but it really developed its name. The Freedmen's Bureau developed its sense of purpose in the immediate aftermath after the Civil War. And its purpose was to clothe, to educate, to provide for slaves, former slaves, medical care, various different aspects to help them get by. It also settled any sort of land disputes or other property disputes or any other things that former slaves had with white owners or anything else along those lines. They were an advocate for that. Okay? So they were just a small outfit. They were small. There were rumors of corruption and things along those lines within the Freedmen's Bureau. But otherwise, they tried to shape black and white life in the South in its new situation. So you also had a Southern Homestead Act in 1866 that would also make 46 million acres available all throughout the South rather, in various different 160-acre plots available for distribution unto slaves. Okay, um, there was a common wisdom around the time through this act, in combination with work done by the Freedmen's Bureau, that former slaves should get 40 acres and a mule. Okay, um, that land and animals, livestock in this case, were somewhat of the building blocks for having a stable household and therefore a stable future. And that could be used as a foundation to reintegrate into society in its new form. That's the idea, at least. Um, there are various different land disputes that would come out between freedmen and white owners or whatnot. But otherwise, so the majority of that didn't actually happen, but there were implementations of which, and there's at least some sort of movement to recognize that former slaves don't have anything, so they need help. They need something to kind of get by. And it kind of ties into what we're now seeing with this pandemic situation. There's a lot of talk about the federal government enacting stimulus, getting various different checks from the federal government. There was a first round under the CARES Act, and now there's all this talk as of first week of May about maybe there being second. And I've seen some where people would get $2,000 a month or $1,000 a month after that, or their kids. You're going to get money from the federal government. There's going to be tax cuts or various different things. Some people argue that that's going to be a form of universal income and a form of socialism. That's not meant to be long term. That's meant to actually get money flooding back into our economy so as to preserve economic growth. If you don't have economic stimulus, then our economic situation is only going to be further stifled for a long time. So this idea that you are going to go in debt, well, 2 or 3 months ago, was ridiculous. Now, if we don't take on some debt to re-inject money into the system, you could do far more harm than borrowing in the first place. You need to do something for a desperate situation. And so, under Keynesian economic theory, you need to flood people's pocketbooks with money, get them spending, and have that money turn over and rebuild your economy from a macro sense, from that standpoint. It makes sense for the federal government to offer money to individuals like you and me. Okay? So, again, a few months ago, I probably would have disagreed with that notion, but in a desperate situation, in this case, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, worse than 2008, mind you, and that was bad. This is worse. Okay? The federal government needs to spend money, and to help people like you and me to pump money back into the economy and get this thing revived again. It's going to take a long time for it to do it. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think you're going to kind of see some ups and downs over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, maybe. But it's necessary. It was necessary to do these sort of things for black people upon the war's end and upon their slavery independence. Okay? So that's one of the things going on with Reconstruction around that time.